Hi everyone, for today's lesson, we are going to learn about the properties of rhombuses and rectangles. Our learning targets for today are for you to be able to say, I can identify and apply the properties of rectangles and rhombuses to solve problems. Before we get started with today's lesson, you're going to need the cutouts for rectangles and rhombuses. The very first lesson is going to be about rectangles, and then we'll head right into talking about rhombuses in our next lesson. So please make sure that you have all of these cutouts ready to go for our lesson. This lesson is going to be split up into two videos, one that's going to be based on each of the shapes. So this one's going to be based on rectangles first, and then we'll talk about rhombuses in the next video lesson. You are going to need a glue stick, some colors, and something to write with. All right, here we go. So a rectangle is a specialized parallelogram. So everything that you know about a rectangle or about parallelograms is true for rectangles as well. And that's because a rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. So this statement right here is really important. A rectangle is a parallelogram. So that means it has all of the properties of parallelograms, and it has 4 right angles. And because there are 4 right angles, that means that special things are going to occur, and there will be additional properties. So let's go ahead and remind ourselves of what we know about about parallelograms. So the first thing that I want to remind you guys of, which I guess before I do that, I would like you to please go ahead and paste in, leaving some space on the side. Well, I guess if we put it right here, this will be fine. No, we'll do space on the side. Sorry, guys. So I'm going to paste this right here so that I can write on the side for you guys. And we're going to remind ourselves of all of the properties of parallelograms, because all of those properties are true when it comes to a rectangle. So here's my rectangle. And one thing that I know is that a rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. So I'm going to start off by marking in my angles using a right angle symbol. So this is something I know about a rectangle. And it is a parallelogram. So let's go ahead and remind ourselves of all of the properties of parallelograms. So remember that, because it has all of the properties of a parallelogram, so I'm going to write has all properties of a parallelogram. And those properties are as follows. Number 1, opposite sides are parallel. So I'm using the parallel symbol right here. Opposite sides are parallel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use color, and I'm going to put in arrows indicating that I have parallel sides. So opposite sides are parallel. The next property is we know that opposite sides are congruent. So I'm going to use some color to mark up that I have congruent opposite sides. My opposite sides are congruent to each other. Next, I have opposite angles are congruent. And now think about that. Opposite angles are congruent. If this is a right angle and this is a right angle, yeah, right angles are congruent to each other. Same thing with this right angle and this right angle. These right angles are congruent to each other. So yeah, that is very true. We have opposite angles that are congruent. Next, we have information about the consecutive interior angles. The consecutive interior angles are supplementary. That means that they add to 180 degrees. And I know that 90 plus 90 is 180. 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 So yes, that is true. My consecutive interior angles are indeed supplementary. So it still is following the same properties of parallelograms with respect to consecutive interior angles being supplementary. The fifth property deals with diagonals. And those diagonals are, if I were to take out a straight edge, I'm going to draw in the diagonals. Here are my diagonals, and we know that diagonals bisect each other. So I can prove that by looking at the length. So here I'm going to work with centimeters. And I have this diagonal is about pretty close to 12 centimeters. And this diagonal is pretty close to 12 centimeters. So they're both, so that's 12 centimeters. And if I were to look at this length going from one corner to the midpoint, it's 6. And if this length is 12, then this is 6 centimeters and 6 centimeters. So these two are going to be congruent to each other. And if this diagonal is 12 centimeters, that means that it's been bisected, 6 centimeters and 6 centimeters. Let me go ahead and verify that. Okay, right there, it's at 6 centimeters. So not only are the diagonals, do they bisect each other, but in a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent. So rectangles have all of the properties of parallelograms, just like normal, but it actually has extra properties. That's what makes it even more special than just simply calling it a parallelogram. The extra properties of a rectangle are as follows, and I'm going to go ahead and paste this directly into my notebook. The extra properties of a rectangle that makes it not just any old parallelogram are as follows. All angles are right angles and congruent. So there are 4 congruent angles. And so those extra properties that make it not just any old parallelogram, but there exists 4 right angles. This is considered an extra property. So it has all of the properties of parallelograms plus 2 more. There are 4 right angles. The other extra property is that the diagonals not only bisect each other, but they are congruent. The diagonals are congruent to each other. So I'm going to draw in the diagonals and I'm going to mark them up using the same tick marks. So not only do they bisect each other, they are congruent. And those are all of the extra properties of a rectangle. So just to recap, a rectangle has all of the properties of parallelograms. Opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent. We have opposite angles are congruent. We have consecutive interior angles are supplementary. They add to 180. 90 plus 90 is 180. The diagonals still bisect each other, but when you calculate them, the diagonals are actually going to be congruent to each other. So that is something I want you guys to keep in mind. Some things to also keep in mind is that the diagonals do not do anything to the opposite angles, so that it doesn't help anyone. And please also know that there exists two pairs of congruent triangles. So that's something else I want you guys to write down. All parallelograms have diagonals that intersect to form two pairs of congruent triangles. So this is something that's like an extra little property that will help you if you are trying to identify information. So like these two triangles right here are congruent to each other. More specifically, in a rectangle, these two triangles are isosceles triangles. That means that their base angles are going to be congruent. Over here, we have ourselves two pairs of congruent triangles, but more specifically, these are isosceles triangles. They're isosceles triangles because we have two sides that are congruent. So that means that their base angles are going to be congruent as well. So this image of looking at a rectangle, not only are their diagonals congruent, but they intersect to form triangles. Now, all parallelograms will have diagonals that will form, intersect to form two pairs of triangles that are congruent, but a rectangle is special because it will form two congruent isosceles. So two pairs of congruent isosceles triangles. And that's going to help you guys when you are creating or answering a lot of the questions that we have. And that is the end of today's lesson. If you have any questions over anything I just showed you about rectangles, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful day. And please stay tuned for the next video lesson over rhombuses.